and welcome back to the Center Square Daily. I'm your host, Greg Bishop, and now let's get Illinois in focus, as the Illinois State Rifle Association says gun owners have run out of options in a case challenging the state's prohibition on carrying concealed firearms on mass transit. Now, that case, Schoenthal versus Raoul, was filed in 2022, and it dealt with whether the state's ban on carrying firearms on mass transit, even a ban for those who have concealed carry permits, is unconstitutional. A district judge said the measure is unconstitutional. An appeals court differed. But this week, the U.S. Supreme Court turned down a petition to hear that case coming out of Illinois. Illinois State Rifle Association Executive Director Richard Pearson said plaintiffs have run out of options.
Well, we're disappointed, of course. I mean, we thought we had a good case. We worked hard on it. We brought the evidence, but now we'll come back, and of course, the district court will issue an opinion against us, and so we'll go from here. We'll see what else we can come up with.
Now, Kathleen Sances, president and CEO of gun control lobby GPAC, she had this to say about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, saying it's a victory for public safety and an important measure of progress in our shared commitment to reduce gun violence in communities across Illinois. That decision shows Illinois is once again leading the country in creating common sense laws that stand up in court and save lives. But Pearson told the Center Square there are other questions in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that could attach to this issue.
Well, right now they have the Wolford case in front of them, which is from Hawaii, which is about public spaces and actually public transportation. So we'll see what they do with that. So we were kind of hoping that for a favorable ruling, at least to take our case, and it didn't happen. So, well, we're left with what we're left with, and so we'll march on and continue.
Pearson said next week, April 15th, Wednesday, Illinois gun owners plan to descend upon the state capitol in Springfield to lobby their legislators against restrictive gun laws.
Well, because you have to put the face of the law-abiding gun owner in front of the legislators. It is, they keep making laws that are supposedly to attack the illegal use of firearms, but the people who use firearms illegally don't care. So the only effect that it has is on people who are law-abiding citizens. They're the ones who pay the price. Who get the inconvenience, who get the higher taxes, who get the more expensive guns, or whatever it turns out to be. They bear the brunt of it, and so it's not the criminal that ever bears the brunt of it.
Now, gun owners will meet at the Bank of Springfield Convention Center Wednesday morning, with doors opening at 10 o'clock. They'll hear from a range of speakers, and then they'll gather to march through the streets of Springfield, several blocks away, to rally at the steps of the Capitol before heading into the Capitol to lobby their legislators. Now, this event, Illinois Gun Owner Lobby Day, has been taking place annually during spring session since 2007. Now, among the laws that they'll target are the Rifle Act, which would increase taxes on gun stores and manufacturers by more than $800 million. But Pearson says that's just one measure that the gun owners lobby is keeping their eyes on at the state capitol.
So we have all those things working. There's 350 gun bills of different types, and so you never know what's going to come out. Well, the Glock ban, it says they can make it a semi-automatic or an automatic firearm out of a Glock. Well, you can do that, but you can do that with a lot of different pistols and rifles. All of them can be converted some way or another if you put enough effort into it. If you give a machinist a block of steel and he turns it into a machine gun, is the block of steel going to be illegal next? So it's you can turn anything into anything if you have enough work on it. The problem, of course, is that the people who are making these switches, which are illegal, aren't getting prosecuted enough. They get a slap on the hands and down the road they go. And so the next guy comes up, makes some money on it, he doesn't care. But the people who use firearms legitimately for self-defense, competitions, hunting, whatever, they're the ones who have to pay the price. And it's just not right.
Now, supporters of that proposed ban on semi-automatic handguns that, quote, can be easily converted to full auto say that the prohibition only impacts those who sell the firearms, not those who currently have such firearms, and the measures and efforts to, quote, nudge the gun industry to steer away from manufacturing these types of firearms. We'll be watching closely on that legislation and what happens. Legislative session ends in Illinois May 31st. Welcome back to the Center Square Daily. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. Now let's focus on Illinois, where state legislators in the land of Lincoln have until a May 31st deadline to pass a plan for how to spend your tax dollars for the coming fiscal year. While the governor is asking for a slightly leaner spending plan than the current year, spending requests for some agencies continue to increase. Tuesday, during a House Appropriations Committee, Illinois State Board of Education State School Superintendent Tony Sanders, he discussed their request of $10.9 billion for the state's schools, saying it's less than the current year's budgets. But another state agency that Governor J.B. Pritzker created a few years ago, the Illinois Department of Early Childhood, came into view during yesterday's hearing. That new agency was sold to streamline services for early childhood by taking a variety of services from several different state agencies and consolidating them into one. Republican State Representative Blaine Wilhauer questioned the Illinois State Board of Education if there's really going to be efficiencies for taxpayers.
They're taking workload off of you guys, and your budget requests are still higher than they were before.
Correct.
And you have the same or more employees today than you did before we created this completely new government agency.
Yes, we're requesting the same number of headcount.
Okay.
It's a little bit different because we are not a code agency, and so we have to do our negotiations separately with our unions. We do not fall under the Central Management Services, and so that process looks a little bit different for the State Board of Education than it did for departments like Human Services and DCFS.
Yeah, but I think that if we asked them the same thing, their headcounts would be more than they are, and their budgets would be more than they were before. So we're really not streamlining government with this new agency.
Wilhauer also recognized the largest line item on Illinois taxpayers' property taxes, and that is schools. Illinois already has the highest property taxes in the country.
Why are property taxes so high?
Again, that's a local issue. Local school districts must make the determination of what it takes to operate their local school system, taking into account state, federal funds, and then what they need locally to survive. It's an individual question for individual school boards about why their local property taxes continue to increase.
Now, Wilhauer seemed to be just getting started with his questions for the state's schools chief. He also asks about the state's standards for student efficiency and proficiency, which were recently adjusted.
Why did the State Board of Education dumb down proficiency expectations in the last year?
So we didn't dumb down the proficiency expectations. We changed the cut scores for the statewide assessments. So as a reminder, when Illinois back in 2014 set new proficiency standards for Illinois students, they chose to go with a cut score in the SAT that was higher than what the College Board says was college ready, making us one of the most restrictive states in the country as it relates to cut scores.
So we lowered standards.
No, the standards remain the same. What we expect students to learn and be able to do remain exactly the same today as they did a year ago.
But there could be people that were not proficient before that would be proficient now because of the standards being lowered.
Again, the standards weren't lowered. The cut score was lowered.
Is that true or false?
We did not lower the standard.
That debate continues. Meanwhile, on the issue of education choice, Wilhauer noted a lot of other states taking advantage of a national school choice scholarship program. Illinois, despite having had a similar state program where private dollars are gifted to scholarship granting organizations for a tax deduction, that program having sunset, Wilhauer asked why Illinois has not joined that national program, which is set to start next year.
Right now, there's people in the state of Illinois, individual citizens that can donate to this private scholarship fund. They can donate to it. They can get a tax credit for it. But kids in Illinois can't access it because politically, apparently, it's unviable for this governor, and apparently it's unviable for the State Board of Education. I'm just wondering why.
Yeah, we've reviewed the big beautiful bill and how it's stated in there. We are still awaiting the rules, though, to come down from the Department of Labor that would actually spell out the rules that would have to be followed for us to implement this program in the state.
What specifically do you want to know? I'm all about, I will help you get answers on that, because I know that there's multiple states that's done that. I've heard multiple people come in here and give that, and frankly, it sounds like an excuse.
Now, after that back and forth between Wilhour and Sanders, the committee's chair, Democratic State Representative Will Davis, challenged Wilhour.
Okay, well, I'm just wondering.
You're going to make that call, Representative?
What's that?
You're going to make that call to Trump to tell him to send the rules?
Let's do it, yeah.
All right. Then when they get the rules, they can move forward.
I am sure these multitude of other states, both Republican administrations and Democrat administrations, aren't just completely flying by the seat of their pants on this.
Without the rules, they probably are.
Oh.
So if you can help us get those rules, we appreciate it.
Well, let's see what we can do on that, and I eagerly anticipate everybody jumping on board once we get these rules.
Again, that program set to take part next year, with individual taxpayers being able to contribute to a national fund and a tax credit from that, but Illinois has yet to opt in. But during yesterday's committee hearing, Republicans weren't done with their questions. Republican State Representative Martin McLaughlin asked the schools chief about teacher-to-children ratios and why there are fewer students but more teachers.
So you then believe, based on the numbers from 9 years ago, they were insufficient based on the number of teachers to student ratio? Now we are 15,000 more teachers with 200,000 less students. Are we there yet? I guess is my question for taxpayers.
I have to do the math. We can certainly look to do the division on the evidence-based funding formula to see if we can align up numbers of positions based on what the formula says it should be. I've not done that. We can certainly look to do that.
Again, schools costing taxpayers a substantial amount in their local property taxes, and that money goes to local school districts. But on top of that, you've got the Illinois State Board of Education requesting about $1 out of every $5 that the state collects in income tax to go to K through 12 schools. $10.9 billion that ISB is requesting. We'll be keeping an eye on that with the team on the ground at the Illinois State Capitol. With the General Assembly continuing on with spring session, they have that May 31st deadline, but a lot of policies being discussed, including the Rifle Act. And the Second Amendment community in Illinois has been very, very heightened alert about this particular proposal, saying it could mean fewer gun stores, fewer manufacturers, and less affordable options for gun owners. Let's go to yesterday's House Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, where the chairperson, Maura Hirschauer, brought together the sponsors and supporters of the Rifle Act, the Responsible Firearm Legislation Act, and they talked about how this bill, they say, will help cut down on gun violence. Here's the sponsor of the measure, State Representative Olakol.
We see roughly 6,700 people injured or killed by firearms each year at an estimated cost of $18 to $20 billion annually. These costs are shouldered by taxpayers, survivors, healthcare systems, and communities. Meanwhile, the firearm manufacturing industry does not share in these financial impacts. This legislation establishes a reasonable and targeted approach to address this imbalance. House Bill 3320 requires firearm manufacturers to contribute to a dedicated state fund as a condition of doing business in Illinois, specifically for selling, importing, or distributing firearms in our state. However, these contributions are not automatic or arbitrary. Manufacturers are required to contribute only when their products are recovered in connection with a firearm injury, death, or suicide.
Now, both sides of this debate debating the legality of it, advocates saying that they have all of the various points covered when it comes to possible constitutional challenges, while opponents of the measure say, don't go that far. They believe that it will face constitutional challenges, some of the back and forth from yesterday.
I want to make clear that this legislation is intended and succeeds in respecting our constitutional framework while simultaneously addressing a critical public safety need. It is built on tested legal principles, supported by Supreme Court precedent, and is grounded in centuries of American legal tradition. The constitutional foundation is solid and the principles are clear.
New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin case, page 30.9, said that because any permitting scheme can be put towards abusive ends, we do not rule out constitutional challenges to shall issue regimes where, for example, lengthy wait times in processing license applications, and specifically, or exorbitant fees deny ordinary citizens the right to public carry. Under this bill, in year 2, if there's $715 million worth of liability, and we have 315 gun sales, which is actually probably half that on the retail level, we're talking about $2,269.75. That might fall under an exorbitant fee per gun under the Bruin constitutional challenge. We also have a federal law, Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act.
So that added cost that the opponents are saying would be added to the cost of somebody going and buying a firearm would be exorbitant, 2,000+%. Others pegging that even higher. Here is another opponent of the Rifle Act saying that this would just make firearm ownership out of reach for an entire class of the socioeconomic ladder.
So going from 1 year set at the 50 million at 158 to the next year potentially being $9,523, that is unstable. It is not consistent. It is no way to do business, period. And it will sustainably impact Second Amendment rights. The fee increases based on more firearms that are recovered from particular manufacturers. This means that if you sell a successful firearm, you stand a higher chance of a higher fee. So the most popular, most accessible firearms that most entry-level people use end up paying the most. That's how this ends up working out.
So the debate continued there with State Representative Patrick Windhorst raising question about the added cost to firearms purchases and what that would mean for a lower income individual who may not have the funds to cover either $7,000 added to the price per one gun or $2,000 added to the price for one gun, or even, as proponents admit, could be $130 to $180 added to the price per gun. Windhorst asking an advocate of the bill how that is beneficial to lower income people who want to be able to exercise their Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms.
Pricing poor people out of owning firearms. We've heard some of that language from different places about that concern. I think poor people don't benefit from owning firearms. I think poor people benefit from access to education, access to resources that allow them to live healthy and sustainable lives and sustains their communities. So this concern about poor people being able to or benefit from owning firearms or being put out of being able to afford firearms is, I think, we are a little bit distracted from what poor people and poor communities actually need.
Sir, I appreciate your opinion. The only way I can say it is that is a very elitist opinion. That you would say to poor people what is good for them or not good for them. Individuals without means want firearms want for hunting, want for recreation, want for self-defense, and the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States guarantees that to them. And it's really not our place to say, well, we think you're better off not having this thing, which is the tone of this committee.
That statement Windhorst said there at the end, that he believes the tone of the Gun Violence Prevention Committee in the Illinois House is to keep firearms out of reach from people with lesser means, riled the chairman of that committee to the point of some kind of exchange that wasn't caught on microphone. But she reiterated that the committee's purpose isn't to keep firearms out of the hands of lower income people, but to work towards addressing gun violence. Now, that measure was only for subject matter. Could it possibly come out of committee later on in session? There were a lot of questions about the bill, including the state's Department of Financial and Professional Regulation opposing the measure, saying that it would add $10 million into costs for that state agency to help enforce the law. And until that aspect's changed, they won't have that particular Pritzker agency on board, plus a whole host of other concerns there. So that's clearly an issue that we're going to be watching at thecentersquare.com. Another issue that passed the Illinois House yesterday comes from Illinois House Speaker Chris Welch. And he has a measure that would restrict detention facilities a certain distance from different types of facilities. Here he is explaining his bill on the House floor yesterday.
And what should be a place of peace and routine for that community has too often become a place of fear, disruption, trauma, and instability. And let me be clear, this bill is not about politics. It's about people. It's about the little kid at daycare who should not grow up around chaos. It's about the family in their home who should not feel like they are living next to a crisis zone. It is about the church member walking into worship who should be met with peace, not tension. It is about saying that in Illinois, we will not place detention facilities in the heart of our neighborhoods and pretend there are no consequences.
Now, Welch used the ICE facility in Broadview, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, as an example of where there's been recent chaos and the increased taxpayer cost of trying to keep the peace on the streets outside of that facility. If you recall, since October, there have been flashes of protesters against ICE having to go up against local police and state police to make their point, but police there to keep the calm, and that's caused quite a disturbance in Broadview. But Welch taking questions from the Republican floor leader, Patrick Windhorst, about the difference between what Illinois is trying to do with the Democrat-sponsored bill versus what California just got slapped down by a federal court over on the West Coast.
There was a decision in the Ninth Circuit which related to California's law. Has this, the language of this legislation been compared with California statute to ensure its constitutionality?
It's my understanding that the California law is a ban. This is a restriction. There's a difference. This talks about within 1,500 feet. This is also the Seventh Circuit and not the Ninth Circuit. I believe that what happened in the Ninth Circuit is certainly distinguishable, and it's not persuasive because we're in a vastly different circuit.
It's generally been held that the Ninth Circuit is viewed as a more progressive circuit than the Seventh, but I won't necessarily go down that road because I don't know that it will get us anywhere productive for this debate.
But Windhorst to the bill said that this continues the ongoing conflict and spurring it further between Illinois and the Trump administration when it comes to immigration policies, and Welch pushing back, saying that Illinois did not start this fight.
We see it with this bill, we've seen it with other bills in the prior year and prior General Assemblies. We are continually picking fights with the federal government. We need to take a hard look at what we're doing as a state to make sure we're fulfilling our obligations to protect our citizens and to enforce the laws, including the federal laws of our country.
I can't ignore that we're not picking a fight with the federal government. The federal government is picking a fight with us. We have states' rights. We know our rights. We know our power. And I wake up every single day saying, thank God I live in Illinois, because we're protecting the people of Illinois. That's our responsibility. And that's what I'm asking that we do here today.
Now, this measure did pass the Illinois House, now goes to the Illinois Senate. They have until May 31st to pass the bill with simple majorities. After that date, it would take supermajorities to get it to the governor's desk. But if it gets to the governor's desk, it would be stacked upon other, what critics call, migrant sanctuary policies like the Trust Act and the Way Forward Act that prohibits state and local law enforcement from cooperating with federal immigration authorities, but also a measure that they passed last year allowing for private rights of action, also known as lawsuits, against law enforcement officials for allegations of violating rights, especially if it's in coordination with immigration enforcement. It also would hold certain facilities responsible for having plans put together to allow for how to react to whether or not ICE shows up to a university or a daycare center or a hospital, for example. Let's talk with the Center Square's Illinois reporter Jim Talamonte about the latest in the saga around former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. Jim, thanks for taking time. Madigan was the longest-serving State House Speaker in State House history, from what I believe, from across the country. But his fall from grace a couple of years ago ultimately landed him in a prison cell last year. And now he wants out. You were in an appeals court yesterday in Chicago for that appeal that Madigan brought forward on being convicted of 10 corruption counts. What's this all boiling down to?
Well, it comes down to what is quid pro quo, something for something, an exchange. Is this part of the normal course of life in politics, or are we talking actual bribery? That was the crux of this case, a trial that went 4 months long, a little bit over 4 months, from October of 2024 to February of 2025. And it was in February of 2025 that a federal jury convicted Michael Madigan, who for about a quarter century was essentially the most powerful politician in the state of Illinois. And his tenure ended in 2021 amidst allegations, and those eventually led to federal charges and the trial, which resulted in Madigan then last June being sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, and where he is now serving at a federal facility in West Virginia. And he's also ordered to pay a $2.5 million fine, which was actually more than prosecutors had asked for. Well, Madigan's team has appealed that, and Madigan himself was not in court on Thursday, but his defense team was, with a new lead defense attorney. And so they appeared before the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in the same building, the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in Chicago, where Madigan was tried and convicted last year. And so this three-judge panel heard arguments, first from the defense. And as was the case during the trial, there was a lot of criticism of the way the case was handled in federal court. There was criticism of the jury instructions, suggestions that the court erred. Michael Madigan had a high-powered defense team, and he added Amy Saharia to lead that team in the appeals process. And this wasn't a lengthy hearing, but there were a number of pointed questions from these judges, two in particular, at Madigan's defense attorney to talk about jury instructions. And the argument essentially from Madigan's team is that the instructions were vague. The counts were vague in terms of the charges related to ComEd and Madigan and bribery and allegations of fraud. And then also there were, according to Madigan's defense team, there wasn't actual quid pro quo. There wasn't something for something exchanged in relation to a state board seat that was Madigan was allegedly going to provide in return for benefits. And so that was the argument from Madigan's team. Of course, prosecutors had a different view of things after those defense arguments. Only one of the four lead prosecutors from the trial was back for this hearing on Thursday. That was Julia Schwartz, assistant U.S. attorney. But she certainly echoed some of her colleagues and her own arguments in the initial trial. And her, main line was, not only was this bribery, this was quintessential bribery. And that was the line she provided. There were some questions for her as well, but it seemed the judge's questioning was a little more pointed at the defense. And so the judges agreed to take this case under advisement. We don't know how long they may take to make a decision. But in the meantime, Michael Madigan sits in a federal facility in West Virginia after, again, he spent years really controlling not only the Illinois legislature, but a lot of Chicago politics as well. And
Well, not just Chicago politics, Jim, state politics. He was chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois, controlling the party purse at the same time saying, hey, legislator, you want to keep your job? You vote for this piece of legislation and I'll ensure that you get Democrat Party dollars to run your race in a year and a half. So you could see that nexus of power that Madigan had for decades in the state of Illinois, and why there was so much criticism from Republicans saying that Madigan was the Velvet Hammer was one, term that was used to describe his power that he had. But clearly what he was convicted of in the ComEd saga, all this being revealed in late 2020, and back then even Republicans saying we need ethics reforms. And then they had their own Illinois House investigation into it, which was chopped off really quick by now current Speaker of the House, Chris Welch, who was just a state representative back in late 2020, but he chaired this special investigating committee that was required once Republicans requested it. Nothing came out of that House-led investigation. It was only after Madigan was replaced by Welch and then stepped down from office and from the DPI, the Democrat Party of Illinois. That's when the feds went ahead and charged him. So to that, all to say, have we seen any true substantive ethics reforms at the Illinois State House in Springfield?
Well, Greg, that depends on who you ask. If you ask Speaker Welch, who replaced Madigan, if you ask Governor J.B. Pritzker, they'll tell you, yes, we passed meaningful ethics reform in the wake of this. This made a big difference. But good government groups, Reform for Illinois, and of course, State House Republicans, well, they're not buying it. And they say the little bit of legislation that was passed in Springfield at the Capitol was watered down and was not effective. So each year we have seen State House Republicans, and actually occasionally some Democrats have proposed ethics moves as well, more geared toward utilities than geared toward their own caucus. But Republicans have proposed bill after bill, year after year. They've called this out in press conferences. We've seen Reform for Illinois and others call for change, call for reform. But the governor, and he's been asked repeatedly by us, Greg, and by other reporters as well, but certainly us as much as anyone at the Center Square have questioned him about ethics. And both he and his lieutenant governor candidate, Christian Mitchell, say, well, we did this. We passed this ethics reform. Things are better now. We see people like Madigan facing the consequences of what they did. But again, good government groups, Reform for Illinois, and especially State House Republicans say it's still too weak, and we still have the same essential power structure, even though Speaker Welch is a different personality than Michael Madigan. Certainly, he holds the same power, and he wields the same power. And now, if you're not on his good
Welch
side,
isn't the chair of the Democratic Party. That's one thing that's a little different here. But when it comes to how the House operates, Welch has kept the same rules that Madigan operated with that Velvet Hammer moniker for decades.
Exactly. And that's been one of the chief arguments. The House floor leader, a Republican minority floor leader, Patrick Windhorst, has said this numerous times. He said, we haven't changed the House rules. We need to change these rules. And although, as you said, Welch doesn't have that purse string power where he's able to, if someone's not on board with him, he's going to make sure they're primaried out, that kind of thing. Madigan, that was going out of Michael Madigan long before we saw in some of these national races. But so Welch doesn't have that party purse string necessarily, but he's obviously one of the, after Governor Pritzker, one of the more powerful voices in the Democratic Party and in the legislature, Greg, as you said. If he's not on board with something, well, it's not getting through. The bill's not getting called. And that goes for members of his own caucus as well as Republicans.
That's right. That's right. But, one thing I think is fascinating is what the Madigan trial really revealed, at least for me as a reporter. I'm sure you being in that courtroom during that duration of the trial and seeing the evidence that they were bringing forward from the, emails, plenty of emails going back and forth between various actors in this, the recorded wiretap phone calls that the feds were getting on Madigan and other players in this saga, and even the undercover video recordings that sources were using to give to the feds. I did put together just a couple of moments here from some of that stuff that you saw in the courtroom and that the federal prosecutors provided. It's from 2017, a couple of weeks apart. It's a phone call between Danny Solis talking about, quote, quid pro quo, and then going to visit Madigan at an office weeks later, and Madigan making a point to take him off to the side from a meeting that was happening to demand that he not use those types of words again. Let's watch that clip.
So I'll meet with them next week on Thursday, and then I'm going to set up a meeting with you and them. Good. And I think they I think they understand how this works, the quid pro quo. Okay. So I just want to let you know that I did that, and I'll follow up with you after Thursday. Very good.
Over the phone, you made a comment that there was a quid pro quo.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
You shouldn't be talking like that.
All right.
You're just recommending.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because if they don't get a good result on the real estate taxes, the whole project would be in trouble.
Yeah.
Which is not good for your ward.
Good.
So again, it goes to show that if the federal prosecutors get some kind of inkling that you're a bad actor, you're likely going to be captured on email or phone or even a trusted source that you're having dinner with a little pocket camera in there or something.
It was remarkable, and that certainly brings back memories, Greg, as I think back about that trial. Hearing that there were over 200 hours of recordings. Wow. There were emails and texts, as you mentioned, some of the back and forth involving Chicago politicians, state politicians, utility company executives, etc. And I talked with defense attorney Sam Adams Jr. He represented former Governor Rod Blagojevich. Remember that name? Illinois governor who was convicted of corruption. There were two trials. Adam was on Blagojevich's defense team for the first of those when there was no conviction. It was only the second trial that led to convictions for Blagojevich. And he said, what you just heard is what this case comes down to. Quid pro quo. Was this actual something for something, or, as the defense team has argued, these were gratuities. These were favors, political favors. This is politics in Illinois and elsewhere. This wasn't actually a getting something in exchange for something. Well, again, the prosecutor, in this case, Julia Schwartz, laid out very clearly, certainly that's her line of argument, and the prosecutors, that this was something for something. There was a fraudulent exchange, and it was, she said, quintessential bribery.
Well, again, it's the idea was that Madigan was lining up certain legislation to benefit the utility company, and then in exchange, he would get his foot soldiers do-nothing jobs for a healthy contract with some of these other organizations that he was getting legislation across the finish line for. So you can see where, again, that just corruption conviction would come from, especially with the feds providing all of this evidence. So, of course, we'll be waiting to see what the appeals court does with Madigan's case, but I think something else too, Jim, that we've got to maybe get an update on or something, or maybe we can have our reporter at the Center Square in Washington, D.C., if they ever get in front of the president again, ask if he's gotten a letter from Mike Madigan requesting a pardon or a commutation or something like that. So that's another story for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. And three members of Congress, the three Republican members of Congress in Illinois, specifically wrote to the president saying, do not consider pardoning this man after what he did to the state of Illinois. Mary Miller, Darren LaHood, and Mike Boss. They said,
but at the same time, though, Jim, the president did commute Blagojevich.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, absolutely. So, and in fact, there was some talk that Madigan's team may reach out to Blagojevich himself to try to put in a word with the president. So, yeah, who knows? This could lead anywhere.
But we also know that Blagojevich and Madigan did not get along at all. Well, again, a lot of palace intrigue there, but again, it's important to point to the accountability that's happening in this particular case. Jim Talamonte from Illinois. Greatly appreciate taking the time.